Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, whatever time of day you're watching this. This is week 10 of not being able to hold a service in the church building, and it's the 7th Sunday of Easter. Let me welcome you to this virtual service, whether you are a regular at Aldridge Parish Church or whether you are a virtual visitor. It's good to have you with us in this way. Well, before we listen to our reading, can I just congratulate the Youth Fellowship on a 24-hour walkathon, which has been completed this morning. I'm not really fooling you, am I, by looking at my watch? You know that I had to record this ahead of time, but if all went well, by 8 o'clock this morning, they will have been walking between them for 24 hours. Brilliant. And if you want to sponsor them, then do go to their webpage. I can't put an active link on the video because we don't have enough followers. But look, if you do this, if you Google AYF Aldridge, then they come up at the top. Well, let's listen now to our Bible reading, which Rachel is reading for us today.
The reading is taken from Numbers 3, verses 1 to 3, then continuing from 17 into the beginnings of Numbers 14. The Lord said to Moses, "Send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe send one of its leaders." So at the Lord's command, Moses sent them out from the desert of Paran. All of them were leaders of the Israelites. When Moses sent them to explore Canaan, he said, "Go up through the Negev and on into the hill country. See what the land is like and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land do they live in? Is it good or bad? What kind of towns do they live in? Are they unwalled or fortified? How is the soil? Is it fertile or poor? Are there trees in it or not? Do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land." It was the season for the first ripe grapes. So they went up and explored the land from the desert of Zin as far as Rehob toward Lebo Hamath. They went up through the Negev and came to Hebron, where Haminan, Seshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, lived. Hebron had been built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. When they reached the valley of Eshcol, they cut off a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. 2 of them carried it on a pole between them, along with some pomegranates and figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol because of the clusters of grapes the Israelites cut off there. At the end of 40 days, they returned from exploring the land. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account: "We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan." Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We can't attack those people, they are stronger than we are." And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword?" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Well, how do you wilt in the wilderness? How do you die in the desert? How do you ensure that you never pass into the promised land? Today's reading gives us some hints. Over the last few weeks, we've been following the story of the ancient Israelites and how they were at one time slaves in Egypt, captives of Pharaoh, treated without mercy and made to do back-breaking work, and how God raised up Moses to rescue them, and how by the mighty hand of God they were set free from Egypt and passed through the sea on dry land. Their destination is the promised land. And the book of Numbers tells us about the time between their rescue from Egypt on the one hand and their entry into the promised land on the other. Time spent in the wilderness. Numbers chapter 13 concerns itself with a bit of a military foray into the land of Canaan. Moses sends 12 men on a reconnaissance mission from their camp in the wilderness to spy out the land and to bring back a report. But it's not just a military exercise, this, nor is it some kind of a geography field trip. It's also a test of faith. And the places which are named here and the places where the spies went are fascinating and instructive. And they begin their mission at Kadesh, in the wilderness of Paran, on the border of the promised land. We don't know that until they return in verse 26, but that is where Moses sends them from, and that is where he receives them back. And they go from there to Hebron in verse 22. And we know from the previous verse that the full extent of their trip was way north, further north even than Damascus. Damascus seems to be off the top of my map. And then on the way back, presumably, they stop off at the valley of Eshcol, where they take a bunch of grapes so massive that it takes two of them to carry it. No one knows where that valley is anymore, the valley of Eshcol. Deuteronomy tells us that it's in the hill country, and so my positioning of it on the map here is a rough guess. So how do you wilt in the wilderness? How do you die in the desert? How do you ensure that you never pass into the promised land? 3 ways, each connected with one of these places. First, you forget God's promises for the future. Second, you forget God's faithfulness in the past. And third, you forget God's resources in the present. All of these places should have been a huge boost for the confidence of these Israelite spies. And yet when they get back, what happens? What happens is that the majority of them put themselves into a fear group. They say, "There's no way we can take that land. Have you seen their cities? They are fortified and they are very large. We haven't got a hope. And have you seen the people? They are massive and they are powerful. We can't win against them. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes and we looked the same to them. We haven't got a snowflake's chance in hell." Only 2 of them put themselves in a faith group. Caleb and also Joshua, we find in chapter 14. Only 2. Caleb says, "We can certainly do it." Chapter 13, verse 30. Of course we can. Caleb has been remembering God's promises. He's been recalling God's faithfulness. He's been considering God's resources. We can do it, he says, Caleb. But there are only 2 men of the 12 who put themselves in the faith group. The rest put themselves into the fear group, and they are destined to die in the desert. Well, let's look at these places. What is so special about Kadesh? Well, Kadesh was in the region where Isaac was born centuries beforehand. Remember geriatric Abram and his equally elderly wife Sarai, who had no children, and the promise they received from God? Genesis 15 verse 5, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then the Lord said to Abram, so shall your offspring be. That's quite a promise to make to a couple in Abram and Sarai's position, don't you think? And yet the Lord kept his promise to them, and Isaac was born. And these spies, all they have to do as they leave Kadesh on their mission is to turn around and look. And they can see how God is a God who keeps his promises. The census in Numbers chapter 1 tells us that there were 600,000 men capable of fighting in the army. So if you include the women and the children, the number of the people of Israel must be vastly more than that. All they have to do is look, and they can see that God is a God who keeps his promises. Kadesh is one big reminder of this, and yet the fear group forgets God's promises, disregards them, counts God as untrustworthy. If you were to give a cheque to our treasurer Phil to support Christian work here in Aldridge and beyond, how would you feel if he took it from you and just tore it up? If he said to you, I don't trust that, it'll bounce. How would you feel? He's never going to do that, by the way. But if he did, you'd surely feel that you had been treated with absolute contempt. Well, that's exactly how God has been treated, verse 23. He's promised them this land. It's not called the promised land for no reason. And he has shown himself to be a God who keeps his promises. Step 1 then, to wilting in the wilderness, to dying in the desert, to ensuring that you never pass into the promised land. Forget God's promises for the future. Well, the spies set off and they come to Hebron. The author makes sure that we know that, verse 22. Well, what's so great about Hebron? Well, it's the only piece of real estate in the promised land that the children of Israel actually already own. And what you can see behind me is the tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron, with its amazing surrounding wall built by Herod the Great in the 1st century BC. That wall wasn't there at the time Moses' spies visited, of course, but the cave it surrounds was there, the cave of Machpelah, bought by Abraham along with the field it was in, as we're told in Genesis chapter 23, and the place where Sarai and Abraham were buried, and later Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Leah. Visiting that place should have been a massive boost of faith to the spies. I go to Jerusalem quite a lot. At least I did. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to go there next year. And I'm often reminded of the astonishing privilege I have in being able to get there so cheaply and in just a few hours. Because I've seen people weeping with joy in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, because they have waited their whole life to visit, and this is their one shot at it, especially visitors from South America and from the Far East. Their faith is built up by going there. They grow a foot taller. Well, this is how it should have been for the spies visiting Hebron. And yet all the fear group among them can do is look at the residents, the descendants of Anak, and say, oh my goodness, look how big they are. We can never be a match for them. Hebron is a reminder of the unshakable faithfulness of God. Read the book of Genesis and look at how they too doubted God's promises and strayed from his path. But look at how God stuck with them time after time, how God was faithful to them. Only Caleb and Joshua passed through Hebron with their Bibles open. The rest forget God's faithfulness in the past. Well, step 2 then, to wilting in the wilderness, to dying in the desert, to ensuring that you never pass into the promised land. Forget God's faithfulness in the past. Well, the spies continue north, and on their return journey they stop off at the valley of Eshcol, and they cut off a bunch of grapes so vast that it takes 2 of them to carry it. Verse 23. And when they get back and they report to Moses, they say this, verse 27, we went to the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is the fruit. It's a sign of the incredible resources of God. And there were 12 men who all saw exactly the same thing, but they divide into a fear group of 10 and a faith group of 2 because of their different perspectives on what they saw. There's an old story told, probably not true, of a Frenchman who had lived in England for a number of years, and he decided to become naturalised. So he did the things that you're supposed to do, and he paid the fee and went through the ceremony. And afterwards his friends asked him if he felt any different. I think I do, he replied. Yesterday, Waterloo was a defeat. Today, it is a victory. Apologies to you if you are French. It all depends on your perspective. So the fear group come back and they say, there's no way we can take that land. Have you seen their cities? They are fortified and they are very large. We haven't got a hope. Have you seen the people? They are massive and they are powerful. We can't win against them. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. But the faith groups say, we can certainly do it. Of course we can. Let's go. The fear group forgets about God's amazing resources on offer, and they compare the giants to themselves, and they feel like grasshoppers. The faith group remembers God's amazing resources on offer, and they compare the giants to God, and they say, we can certainly do it, because that's the comparison that matters. If God says he's going to be with you, then he's going to be with you. The size of the challenge ahead is not a problem, if that's your perspective. So how do you wilt in the wilderness? How do you die in the desert? How do you ensure that you never pass into the promised land? 3 steps modelled to us by the spies. First, you forget God's promises for the future. Second, you forget God's faithfulness in the past. And third, you forget God's resources for the present. Well, the New Testament commentary on all of this is found in the letter to the Hebrews, chapters 3 and 4. And it's worth having a read of those chapters if you want to increase your appreciation of what the book of Numbers means for us today. And let me show you just one verse. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 1. Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. I said last week that the book of Numbers tells us about the time between salvation accomplished, the people have been saved from Egypt, and salvation completed. They've not yet entered the promised land. They're in the in-between time, camping in the wilderness and moving from place to place. Well, the writer to the Hebrews sees our current age in the same way. Salvation has been accomplished. Jesus has offered his life on the only true altar, his cross outside the city gate. But it's not yet been completed. There is an enduring city to come which must yet be entered. And in between, well, here we are in a kind of wilderness age, but one in which God supplies us with all the resources of his Holy Spirit for life and for faith. So what is it you need to remember today? Where do you need to be encouraged? Is it God's promises, God's faithfulness, God's resources, God's promises for the future, God's faithfulness in the past, God's resources, his wonderful Holy Spirit in the present? Where do we need to come back and ask for God's help to prevent us from wilting in the wilderness? Do just take a moment to pray.